And we can't blame the drug for the addiction, just like we can't blame food for individuals' food addiction. And we have to consider in that parallel metaphor, why is it that drugs get weaponized, but not food?
When I heard the podcast, I mean, before we even get into everything that was said, I'm like, he's a professor's professors. Like, you joined the academy, whether you're talking about drugs, criminal justice, any issue, to discuss and test the boundaries of what you're talking about. I mean, in the world that's kind of filled with like, hey, don't talk about critical race theory, don't talk about this, don't talk about that. That's controversial. The academy, I don't know about you, what drew me to places we could have. I mean, I went to college when I was 15. So the greatest thing was like, oh my God, we're having like these conversations that you can't have at the dinner table, or you can't have. And it just seemed like having the conversation that you two had, it was like a conversation with two friends talk like what we do in office hours. You say, hey, I wonder what you think. I wonder what you think about this idea that we usually can't have, when we go home for Thanksgiving or winter break. So that's what I appreciate about the episode. Is like, man, he made me fall in love again with the academy. Like, wow, people are having these interesting conversations and helping us to think about these in different ways.
Right. Yeah. I had a friend who texted me as soon as they listened. They were like, oh, now we're getting critical. I was like, yeah, this is a critical ass conversation. Like,
well, we should talk, like, can we debunk that? I think we've talked like critical is like a dirty word, I feel like now.
Yeah. In thinking of what is critical, like the reason for me that this conversation was so critical in the meaning of the term, like necessary, crucial, vital, important, is that it challenges so many of our assumptions, and it really forces us to reflect on how those assumptions are built, right? Like, he's a neuroscientist from Columbia University telling me that what I've learned about drugs, like, he's the expert here, and what I've learned about drugs throughout my entire life is essentially wrong. And it honestly, this conversation has made me change a lot of my viewpoints about a lot of things. Like, even controversial, I was having a conversation with my dad. We had someone close to the family, and this is kind of getting dark quick, but we had someone close to the family commit suicide in a very intentional way. Like, they put notes on all of their belongings and wrote a letter. And my dad was saying how horrible that was. And I was kind of thinking about it with this mindset that I gained through the conversation, where I was like, well, it is his life. Like, he can choose. He didn't have a choice really in coming into this life. And now he can choose what he wants to do. And I think, and that was really hard for my dad to kind of wrestle with that idea of choice and having it be so autonomous. And I think that's something that Carl really got into, was this idea of like, why are we policing individuals' drug use? And I think at least in the interviews that I have with police, so often their answer to that is, well, because drugs cause crime and violence. But then Carl makes the great point of like, we have all of these rich ass people doing drugs, not engaging in crime, or at least what their actions are not perceived as crime. We have all these events like Burning Man and Electric Daisy Carnival, where there are mad people coming together doing a mad amount of drugs. And we don't think of those events as like hot spots of crime and violence. And so if it's not the actual drug that's causing, because we know in social science we can never say in human behavior that A causes B, if we know that drugs aren't the lead reason for engagement in acts that are deemed criminal, then we have to pull back those layers. And I think that's what makes this conversation so critical.
And Carl had me thinking, because I remember, I always get my hair cut at the barbershop, and the barbershop is like this place. The barbershop is also one of those unique spaces where it's intergenerational. People are saying wild and crazy things, but we're having this conversation. I was naive. I was a criminologist, and I was saying, hey, open air drug markets, and what about all these things? And one of the people in the barbershop said, basically, listen, I sold drugs. I'm not proud of it, but I will say this: when there are drugs on the street, things are actually calm because people are like have resources to money. So he was like, usually if I'm in a conflict with another person and I'm selling a lot of drugs, I'm like, you know what? Let me just something I might address. I might just let go because like, hey, I'm making all this money. So it's really interesting when you get, and that's what Carl was saying, we need other perspectives. And the criminal justice system loses legitimacy when we tell, I thought that was so important. He said, when we tell each other lies, right? About, hey, don't mix this drug with that drug, or that drugs actually cause crime, because people who are engaging in drug using and drug selling are saying, hey, that's BS, because people who are selling drugs are saying, hey, when drugs are on the street, there's peace, they're calm. People don't want to rival. People don't want to mess up their situation or draw attention to that situation. And so then we have to ask ourselves, why do we police people's choices? Why do we do that? And one of the things that Carl talked about, and I love this line that he says, is we stigmatize or we police people's drug use for the people that we do not like.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was so profound. And that it took me a minute to think. He said, when you think about it, he was like, we don't like certain groups of people. And instead of just saying, hey, we don't like said group, we'll just criminalize or stigmatize or use laws to say, we don't like the things that you do.
Right. Yeah. And the importance of setting, right? Like, so I was just thinking as you were talking, I was thinking about like a group of white hippies doing ayahuasca in a ceremony in the desert. And like that scene, you watch Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind, and that's seen as this like very transformative wellness experience. And then you think about like a group of individuals who are houseless, who are on a corner, like sitting in a circle, chanting and like on PCP, which is essentially like the same kind of thing, but a different setting. And all those people would be arrested, like it's such a difference in who it is and where it is. And also when we perceive of why it is, right? Like those people in the desert doing the ceremony are like trying to transform themselves and be better people. Whereas we look at the people that are doing that on the corner as like a nuisance and they're just like messed up people, right?
Yeah. And before we take a deep dive, because I have an article here that I think is perfect that I got from the Equal Justice Initiative. If people are not familiar, you should go to the site. It's Brian Stevenson Talk, the great lawyer who's working a lot to reform the criminal justice system. But what attracted you to the book? And also, can you give the title again? I think it's Doing Drugs for Grown-ups.
Yeah, Drug Use for Grown-ups.
Drug Use for Grown-ups.
Yeah, and I think
I know you heard him on the podcast, but I'm an avid reader. I love to read.
Yeah.
And I haven't come across this book, but how did you become attracted to it? Like, how did it even get on your radar?
I think it just got on my radar, honestly, from hearing him on being interviewed by other people. And then I was like, oh, I gotta read this. And then when I read it, I say this in like the very first sentence of our interview where I'm like, oh, when I read this line that was talking about the fact that only 10 to 30% of those who use even the quote unquote hardest drugs are actually addicted, according to the DSM-5, the diagnostic, what is it? Statistical manual? Diagnostic.
What is the DSM-5? Psychiatric and psychological assessment inventory, pretty much to assess whether someone is addicted or not, which I thought was important because I thought I had a very surface level or very, I guess, secular or popular version of addiction. Oh, that person's, addicted, and he's like, no, there it is. And also, as a cause of death, I thought that was really interesting that we don't know that, we just know that drugs were in the system, but we can't even say that this caused this or this concoction caused that. So I thought that was really important too.
Right. Yeah. Like even the fact that when legal substances are mixed up in it, we don't even really discuss that it could have been the alcohol, it could have been the, whatever the legal drug that was being used in tandem, but we focus so heavily on the illicit drug. But yeah, so he was saying how those 10 to 30% are actually addicted. And so if the majority of people who aren't using drugs are not addicted, then we can't blame the drug for the addiction, just like we can't blame food for individuals' food addiction. And we have to consider in that parallel metaphor, why is it that drugs get weaponized, but not food in that situation?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Also, if you think about, I know food could be like a frivolous concept. My mind went to casinos. So, casinos you got to think about, a lot of people gamble. There are a lot of casinos.
Oh, yeah.
I know a lot of people who like to go to casinos. A lot of people who frequent casinos or use casinos for pleasure or for a getaway, as a lot of people do. We wouldn't say, I think probably, I don't know the literature, but I would say I wouldn't say it's 50% of people who like have a gambling addiction. It's probably, and we know those small amounts of people who do have a gambling addiction, but most people go to casino, they may spend a little bit more than they want to spend, but they're not like they have a gambling addiction. I thought that was really well. So what is it that we weaponize drugs? So this article here is called Racial Double Standard in Drug Laws Still Persists Today, from the Equal Justice Initiative. And it says, there's a racial gap in drug enforcement and sentencing, which is a byproduct of America's punitive response to the crack crisis of the late 80s and the war on drugs as it unleashed. So we all know talks about President Nixon, who created the war on drugs in 1971 in order to criminalize Black people. And a decade later, right, he called for the capitalizations of heavy, kind of a punitive approach to crack cocaine. And there were a lot of media stories that were kind of sensationalizing crack babies and crackheads and kind of super predators. But what was interesting is that we have a more kind of compassionate view of drug addiction today. So racial inequalities and drug arrests and sentencing still persist. And Helen Hansen, she's an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry in New York. She says, when white people started getting addicted and dying from opioids, the narrative shifted. Those abusing heroin and prescription painkillers were routinely depicted in the media as sympathetic victims. And not only did she say that the media changed, also she said public policy shifted. So 3/4 of the $7.4 billion of Congress allotted in 2018 to fight the opioid epidemic went to research, treatment, and prevention rather than police and prisons, which was the opposite response. I think that was very, and so all that to say is that, I want our listeners to understand that even though the context of what Carl was talking about, he was really pushing the idea of drug use, that we've had this very different response to drugs versus kind of this crack cocaine, and then these kind of heroin and opioids, two different responses, which is really, really interesting when I think about the idea. He said we stigmatize and we weaponize drug use for the people that we don't like.
Yeah, 100%. It's so obvious. Like it just is so obvious, especially like in the 80s when you had the 100-to-1 cocaine to crack. And we think about the narrative around crack and the crack epidemic. I mean, I went to a police training recently and they were talking about the crack epidemic so frequently. And I was thinking, like, at that time, there were so many white people doing coke at clubs, like that was a very frequent occurrence. And yet you don't hear about coke babies, like coke babies are basically like Nepo babies, they're like, that's so I think it's so obvious. And when you were thinking about drugs, I was looking because I was so curious thinking about when you just were talking about casinos. I was so curious, like how many people actually die from drug use every year? And so I found that in 2020, 68,630 overdose deaths because of opioid involved overdose deaths. So again, we can't say that it was because of the opioid, but it's the opioid involved. So 68.5 thousand essentially, which is a lot. I mean, that's horrible. And that's a lot.
Yeah.
But then I looked, and 140,000, so more than double, people die from excessive alcohol use every year.
Wow.
And then 480,000 deaths per year in the US as a result of cigarette smoking.
Yeah. I thought you
480. Like, that's crazy. And so that's like half of, I mean, that's
I know a
wild.
lot of people that smoke cigarettes.
Yeah. And so when we think about these narratives, one of the responses could be, well, we should ban, just as we ban drugs, we should ban cigarettes and ban alcohol. But as Carl stated, we tried that. Like, we tried banning alcohol with the prohibition, and we saw that people were just continually making illicit alcohol that was really dangerous, that was causing people to
because they're making moonshine in their bathtub.
Right. And that's what we're seeing today. Like, that's why we have so many overdoses and so many issues with drug use, is because of a lot of times it's because of the contaminants. People don't know what they're taking because they have to get it on the black market, and because of the rise in fentanyl, which is really interesting because my partner's brother is a nurse, and I always only thought of fentanyl in the black market context.
No, it's used in hospitals.
It's used in
Prescribe
hospitals
it.
all
Yeah.
the time.
Yeah.
And so it's not like some like evil drug that the cartel created. It was a drug that's used all the time in hospitals to manage pain. And so when we think about fentanyl contaminating heroin, people can use fentanyl and abuse it, but if they know what they're doing, then they know that it's highly potent, and so they're more risk averse in their use. Whereas if you're taking heroin, which you would need a higher dose of to get the same high, but you don't know that it's laced with fentanyl, then you're dealing with a whole different, much more dangerous situation. So when Carl is talking about the importance of legalization of drug testing. I mean, I live in Arizona, and you go to the weed dispensary that's like right down the block from my house, and it has all the percent of THC and CBD, and you understand, okay, there's a peanut butter cup this big that has 100 milligrams of THC. I should only have like this much if I'm trying to like have a chill night, or if I want to go, like, what kind of situation you're going to put yourself in. And we don't give that same respect, right? It's kind of like giving respect to someone to know what they're doing. We don't give that same respect to individuals who want to experience these other drugs, or at least we don't give the respect to individuals who want to experience these drugs who are part of that stigmatized group, because we know, again, that there are individuals who are of a higher status who are using these drugs that they know because they have the ability to test them. Like, I think of a friend of mine who, she had the ability to test her MDMA because of her position in a university. And so she was able to see what she was using. And that's a position of privilege that everyone should have the ability for.
And also, I was thinking too, maybe this is the conspiracy theorist in me too, is why have we weaponized drugs? And even though we have a war on drugs, why can't we just easily just say, hey, we've gotten this wrong and let's address it? And I realized too, because when we think about this, when we think about the state as an entity, I believe that the reason why we still kind of have this punitive approach, because the state will have like, even I think about cannabis, marijuana legalization. And I think, wow, states are strapped for budgets. I mean, all over schools, we need roads. Clearly a lot of doctors, I mean, Sanjay Gupta, he's been on CNN talking about the benefits of marijuana. It is not a Schedule I drug. And I believe the reason is because we've entered into this crisis of mass incarceration, then the state would have to acknowledge that the people who they've imprisoned, who either sold drugs or used them, are not criminal. And I don't know if we're ready to have that conversation because and I'm thinking about not only for marijuana, but also other high level of drugs as well, right? Because now if the state regulates drugs and the state is over control of the drugs, so you're saying that it's all right for the state to have done it, but individuals who've done the same thing are wrong. And I think it would shift our mindset about, because we know that, I mean, Paul Butler, we'll talk about this in our deep dive, really interesting. He talks about that the majority of what we've done with the war on drugs is really kind of locked up drug users and drug sellers, mostly nonviolent offenders.
Right. You know, so in that police training that I went to, I had a conversation with a former police chief, and he was saying how he was working in California. And do you remember when there was that like mass release of people in California prisons
Yes.
because of the overcrowding? And
yeah, they had to let people go. They just literally they couldn't.
Right.
It was like, I think an article was coming up, like they had 3 and 4 or 5 people in a cell or something crazy like that.
Yeah. And like low key, they really just filled the jails, but they released a bunch of people because of overcrowding. And so this guy who I was speaking to was, I think he was a police commander at the time, trying to be chief. And he put together an $11 million grant proposal for reentry, because he was like, we have all these people that are going to come in. They have no resources. We've given them no skills in prison. So what are they going to do when they come back into our community? And the chief at the time read his grant and said to him, you're never going to get anywhere and you'll never become chief talking about not putting people in prison. Which was essentially like saying, we know that these people are going to end up back in prison, and that's part of the game. Like, it's functioning as it should. And I know that people say that and people like take that as some conspiracy theory, but that shit's real. And like, people in positions of power are saying these things, right? And so we have to understand that the war on drugs is a massive money-making scheme.
Yeah.
And so
well, I think even when it gets to the conspiracy theory, what the war on drugs did is it changed the incentive structure, as we're talking, of the criminal justice system.
Right.
And the policies and the procedures people say, oh, we used to have money for medical hospitals, and people had psychiatric hospital and for homelessness. And basically, what's the most devastating thing about the war on drugs, and when we say we want to end the war on drugs, is that the funding mechanism now gives billions and billions of dollars to police. It bypasses all those resources and give them to police. And so, I mean, I feel like I'm a progressive person, but if I, quit my job today, tomorrow, and somebody said, hey, you want to be the chief of police of, I don't know, in Arizona, I would say yes, because I don't have a job. And it wouldn't be in the best interest of my job to not say I want to put people in prison. And it's not because I'm a bad person. It's just, that's the incentive nature of the job. Right. And so I think a lot of times we direct our attention and anger into the people. And that's why we have conversations around abolition, is because it's really not, you can be the best person you want to be, but at the end of the day, when it comes to self-preservation, whatever the incentive structure is for your job, you're going to have to appeal to that incentive structure, to your job. And trying to give you a point, to give you a deep dive, what Carl was talking about is not a new concept. I want our listeners to know this, not a new concept. This has been talked about in criminal justice for a long time. In 2009, Paul Butler wrote a book called Let's Get Free. You should really check out Paul Butler. He's a dynamic lawyer as well. And in 2009, when we were undergraduate students, this was very controversial. And also, I want to tell people, we haven't come this far in the drug conversation, because in 2009, it was, Paul Butler's book, Let's Get Free, was very controversial, the way he was talking about drugs. And Paul Butler talks about this idea that prior to the war on drugs in the 19th century, drugs were completely legal, right? He said you could walk into your local drugstore and purchase opium, cocaine, marijuana. It wasn't a big deal. And he says we start to see the beginning of the criminalization of drugs has kind of less utilitarian origins, right? Beneficials. But really, in 1875, they were feared that kind of these Chinese men had these opium houses and that they were going to seduce kind of like white women. And so these were kind of, Paul Butler kind of lays it out very interesting. And so he says, because we kind of have a war on drugs, again, the incentive structure has changed for our listeners, is that they also classify drugs. And they classify drugs into Schedule 1 drugs or Schedule 2 drugs. Schedule 1 drugs mean no medical benefit, completely terrible. Things like PCP, LSD, but also one of the things that really hurt urban communities, that marijuana was a Schedule 1 drug, and it still is a Schedule 1 drug. And we haven't done those things as well. And so basically we lock so many people up, drug users, drug sellers. And so Paul Butler says what the war on drug means is that we've taken nonviolent offenders, really exposed them to violent ones in prison settings, and then reintroduced them into our communities. And so his premise of the book is that ending the war on drugs was the best way to stop mass incarceration and make neighborhoods safer. And for people that are saying, hey, I think that's crazy, I want to give a little bit of Paul Butler's resume. He's a Harvard and Yale graduate, was a former prosecutor himself, for a federal prosecutor who was wrongfully convicted. He represented himself, won that case, and now went to the public defender side. I think he's doing more professorial work. I don't know, I can't say that word, but he's a professor now, but has a great resume and has thought very critically about this issue. So Paul Butler says in the book, he talks about this idea of harm reduction, which is a criminal justice term. Carl talked about it, but I guess the criminal justice equivalent would be harm reduction. And harm reduction, he says, basically, and Carl talks about this, he said people have kind of free will, it's in the Declaration of Independence, right? These are American ideals. And harm reduction kind of piggybacks off the ideas. And Paul Butler says we pretty much have two choices, right? We can accept that people are going to obtain illegal substances and reduce the harm the best way we can. Or we can pretend that we can stop people from using illegal substances and punish them for what they put in their bodies. But when we punish them, the result is an increase in users, a vast army of lawbreakers, an open disrespect for the law, and a rise in crime. Right. And I think we have to wrestle with those ideas. And I think that's what Carl was saying. We kind of really have two options. And we talked about this. Either we can accept that people are going to use illegal substances and reduce the harm, or we can pretend that we can stop what people put in their bodies.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think something to note too, like thinking about the stigmatization and criminalization of certain individuals who we know are minoritized. There's something to say that the two professors who are Ivy League bred and who are putting forth these really critical ideas are both Black men, and the fact that their voices haven't necessarily been considered as viable options or taken seriously, I think also says something about the academy and says something about our social policy and who we trust to give us legitimate information, right? Like Michael Pollan, who has no scientific degree, he's a journalist. People are more willing to listen to him, as Carl says, about drug use and hallucinogenics than Carl, who's a neuroscientist at Columbia University. And so I think that's an important point to raise as well.
That's really interesting too, because one of the things that attracted me to both Carl's work and Paul's work is that Carl, I think, grew up in Florida, I think he grew up in Florida. I'm not sure but he grew up in an inner city community. Yeah. And he believed that drugs were the reason why his community looked like that. And over his 30 years of experience as a Black man from an inner city, he realized that, no, that's not the case. And a theme from our last segment was people need housing. People need access to opportunities. And when you're kind of using drugs and you don't have things structurally the way it looks like, then all those other things play out. But it's really not the drug itself. Also, with Paul's work is him being a federal prosecutor. He really implicates the system as being a federal prosecutor and being wrongly convicted as a Black man, and and going through that experience to say Now I realize that this kind of criminal justice thing is not as slated as it's supposed to be. And what Paul talks about this idea when he was a federal prosecutor, he talks about the games he used to play with police. He used to drive around with police officers, and basically, if somebody had a air freshener from the window, they would try to figure out how they could stop the car, right? And these tactics that happen. So he talks about the efficiency and the fairness of the system is ultimately broken, and we have to challenge those particular aspects. But it's really interesting that you have Black men who've been affected by this, who are then reporting solutions. They're not just grabbing them out of thin air. They've been affected by it. They've seen it and says, you know what? I think that we have gotten it wrong. And I think Carl didn't really talk about it as much, but the consequence of getting it wrong is what kind of Paul Butler talks about, this idea that we're going to have an increase of users, like this vast army of lawbreakers, open disrespect for the law, and a rise in crime. So I think the legitimacy of the criminal justice system gets called into question when we have these punitive responses for things that are not the way we think they are. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's also opposite of what the public probably thinks, right? Like they think that if we criminalize it, the users will go down, but we see users go up. And then when we have places like the Netherlands, where cannabis has always been legal, or at least has been for like our generation, there are less users of our age in that place because there's less of this kind of forbidden fruit temptation, because it's just available. But again, like even with availability and all these things, and whether it's good or whether it's bad or whether it has benefit, like again, why does the state have say if my use is not hurting other people, right? Like, and I think then probably someone will say, well, but drugs lead to crime, drugs lead to violence. And what we've already established here is that it's not the drug, because we have different settings, different, more wealthy, established, supported, resource people doing drugs. We know they do drugs. Let's stop pretending that wealthy people aren't using opioids and cocaine and hallucinogens.
Wealthy people, just say everybody. Let's just say everybody. Let's not pretend that everybody, whether it's alcohol, cigarettes, more illegal drugs, more hard drugs, everybody's using drugs. So let's just
right. So if we know that, then it's only a small population of people who are actually engaging in acts that are deemed criminal, or engaging in acts that are being hyper surveilled by police and then being criminalized. And so if it's not the drugs, because we know everyone's using them, then it's about inequality, right? Like when it gets down to it, that's the harmful element here. It's not necessarily the drug that's the harmful element. It's our social inequality and our capitalist system that perpetuates individualism, right? Like I don't care about my neighbor. I just care that I do, like, I mean, the example you gave of you becoming a police chief and being incentivized to keep your job, even if you know that it's harming the community, is like the perfect example of capitalism, right? Like living in a place, in a state of need, like always, even if you have everything, you still need and want, because we're socialized into that. And so thinking about, well, what is then the question really begs, like, what is the state doing? Why are we still in this place of paternalism?
Yeah. And I think people have been questioning more and more, how does the state have moral authority over all these issues? Who is punished to die, right? Death row. Who is punished for a drug? How is the state morally, given the history and the context of its abuse of power and its issues on getting things wrong, how did they become the moral authority to say this is right and this is wrong?
It's coming from the top down, right? The incentive structure is coming from the top down, but the police officers who are actually engaging with community members are like, we can't arrest our way out of addiction. We can't arrest our way out of homelessness. We can't arrest our way out of mental health issues. Like we're not doing the right thing. And we keep seeing the same people funneling in and out of jails and prisons because we're not actually getting anyone the support that they need and the resources that they need. And so, like, even that police chief I was talking about who wrote the grant, he
Mm-hmm.
was saying that he was sitting in a room with like 90 other police chiefs, and it was right as the defund movement was kind of picking up steam, and they were all like up in arms. And
Yeah.
he kind of took control of the room, and he was like, I've met with you guys once a year for the last 10 years, and you all have been bitching and moaning about how we have to deal with individuals that we don't have the skill set for, how most of our time is wasted because we're dealing with social problems. And we just had this opportunity to give resources to the people who do that every day, who that is their pure skill set. And we wasted it because of our egos,
Yeah.
because we weren't the ones saying we should give it, because other people were saying it, even though we've wanted that. And I
Yeah.
think that that says something when we're not even listening to police officers when it comes to thinking about better policy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about, because a lot of them were saying how, they, when they come across cannabis use, it's like, whatever. And when it comes to paraphernalia, at least this city that I was doing interviews in is moving towards diversion programs. So
Yeah.
bringing people to crisis centers and not arresting them. But there's still some level of discretion. And so I had an interview, for instance, with a police officer who was like, I'll bring someone to diversion and not to jail if they demonstrate remorse in their drug use, which was wild to me because I was like, wow, I feel like that's beyond the scope of what a police officer is supposed to do. And again, like, the taking advantage of having that kind of authority and moral authority over others is so problematic.
Mm-hmm. And I want to bring this before we have questions for our question from the audience. I want to land this plane because I don't want people to step away like, oh my goodness, this is crazy. I think what we're saying, and Carl, who comes from another field, is saying what we've kind of thought about drugs, how we are punishing people for drugs is silly, right? And before you say, I don't know if I agree with that, criminologists have universally, well, let me say 99.9% agreed to say that the way we think about drugs and punish drugs is silly.
I I know we should end there. I have so much more to say, but let's get to a question.
Okay.
So I have a question from a listener who says, in the interview with Dr. Hart, he talks about how the stigma around drug use is tied more to the group of users than the substances themselves. What other double standards do you see as a place to deconstruct as a means of liberation, i.e., grocery theft versus wage theft or price gouging? Which is really interesting. I
I mean,
mean, there are so many double standards
I
in the
think the main one is white collar crime. There's a whole
yeah,
field of study. That's the biggest double standard. And so the question becomes, and I think when we talk about drug use, we're talking about wealthy people, for people that go to the best schools, that were raised by the best families, who live in the best neighborhoods, who had the most resources, why do they still engage in crime?
right.
And you have people who come from way worse situations, and we kind of you look down these individuals, but those individuals and white collar crimes, even though it's not shooting, killing, stealing, robbing, is okay. You got the BP oil spill, which is contaminating the earth, or you have Bernie Madoff, who have
Right.
took a lot of people's life savings, or you have things like Martha Stewart, and she does inside trading, and she saves herself, goes to jail for a little bit. And it's so interesting that Martha gets to hang out with Snoop Dogg and still gets to have her career. And so that's I mean, we could talk about a lot of double standards, but I mean that's the really big one in our field. White collar crime is very understudied. Still, it's not a lot of research, but that's something that we don't account for. I feel like we don't really talk about it as criminologists.
Never. That's not what because that's not what the criminal legal system was made for, right? Like, if we're going to say that like the system is functioning as it is supposed to, like those white collar criminals or individuals who committed white collar crime, those were people who like were accidents. They were like, oh shit, we didn't mean for you to be a part of this, but I guess like, to be fair, we should have some of you, like it wasn't created for that. And that's why we see so many wealthy people be able to do drugs and not get in trouble for it or not be demonized for it, when others can't. And the double standard I always think about, and this is not to condone murder in any way, but when we think of murder, we think of it as like the worst crime ever. And yet we justify and glorify state-sanctioned murder in war, in the death penalty. I mean, by committing people to life in prison, those are all the
Murder.
state committing murder or sanctioning murder. And so I think it's really just about power and who we, and maintaining a hierarchy. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much for joining Office Hours with Abbie and Juwan. If you liked this, please subscribe, like it, give it a thumbs up, and definitely listen to the podcast. Shoot us some questions at ccofficehours@gmail.com so we can address it in the next episode. And I look forward to you being part of the conversation then. Thanks.